Clara Whitfield pressed her back against the cold wall and stopped breathing. On the other side of the curtain, a man laughed and put a price on her life. $3,000. That was what she was worth to them. Not as a woman, not as a daughter, as a joke. She could have walked away. She could have wept in the carriage home. Instead, Clara Whitfield smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin, and stepped through that curtain like a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. This one doesn't end the way they planned. The summer of 1816 was the kind that made New York City feel smaller than it actually was. The heat pressed down on the streets like a hand that wouldn't lift, and every drawing room in the city smelled of candle wax, rosewater, and other people's opinions. By August, the social season was grinding toward its last gasps, one final round of gatherings before the wealthy retreated to their estates upstate, and the rest of the city tried to survive until October. Clara Whitfield had not been invited to Congressman Aldrich's candlelit supper. She had come as a courtesy. Her Aunt Mercy Bell had been specifically requested as a guest, and Clara had been permitted to accompany her as what the hostess privately called a shadow arrangement. Not a guest. Not quite a servant. Simply a woman of reduced circumstance, whose presence was tolerated because her aunt was useful, and her own behavior had never in 27 years given anyone a reason to formally exclude her. That was the particular cruelty of Clara's position. She was never quite thrown out. She was simply never quite let in. She stood near the window at the far end of the parlor, half hidden by the heavy blue curtain that separated the main room from the narrow side corridor where servants passed with trays. She had retreated there 20 minutes ago, when Harriet Coles had called her such a devoted old companion to dear Mercy, in a voice pitched just high enough for 3 other women to hear. Clara had smiled, excused herself, and walked away before her expression could betray anything useful. Now she stood in the corridor, her back straight, her hands folded over the black printer's ribbon at her wrist, and listened to the party continue without her. She was not weeping. Clara Whitfield had not wept in public since her father's funeral 4 years ago, and she did not intend to begin again tonight. She was simply standing very still the way a person stands when they are deciding what kind of woman they are going to be for the rest of their life. Then she heard Julian Ashford laugh. Julian's laugh was distinctive, bright and careless. The laugh of a man who had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from. He was somewhere just beyond the curtain, close enough that Clara could hear the ice shift in his glass. "Come now, Vale," Julian was saying. "It's barely a wager at all, more of a charitable exercise. I don't do charity." The second voice was lower measured. Nathaniel Vale. Clara recognized it the way you recognize a sound you've been warned about, certain unhurried, carrying the particular weight of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in whatever room he walked into. Think of it as sport, then. Julian laughed again. $3,000 says you cannot bring Clara Whitfield to the governor's winter ball on your arm. Willingly. In a decent dress. Smiling. A pause. "Whitfield," Nathaniel said. "The printer's daughter." "The spinster printer's daughter," Julian corrected, and Clara heard the smile in it, the absolute ease of his cruelty. 7 and 20, no prospects, no fortune, no family connections left worth mentioning since Elias ran off with the militia money. She's been Mercy Bell's shadow for 2 years. Half the city thinks she's already a lost cause. The other half has simply stopped thinking about her at all. And you think I can't bring her to the ball? I think she'd sooner set the ballroom on fire than let a man like you court her. She's proud, stubborn, and she has absolutely no idea how to calculate when pride becomes a luxury she can't afford. Julian's voice warmed with something that was almost affectionate, the way men sometimes spoke warmly about animals they found entertaining. 3,000 Vale. Think of what you could do with a story like that at your club. Another pause. Longer this time. 3,000, Nathaniel said quietly. Done. Clara did not move for a full 10 seconds. She stood perfectly still behind the curtain and felt the heat of August and the heat of something far older and far more dangerous rise through her chest in a single clarifying wave. $3,000. They had put a price on her humiliation, while 12 feet away, women discussed the proper thread count for autumn linens. They had turned her survival, her careful grinding dignity, preserving survival, into an evening's entertainment. And Nathaniel Vale, who had never spoken a single word to her in his life, had agreed to it in the same tone a man used to order a second glass of brandy. Clara's hand closed around the printer's ribbon at her wrist. Her father's voice came back to her the way it always did. Not comforting exactly, but clarifying. A press doesn't care who's angry, Clara. It prints the truth and lets the truth do the work. She stepped through the curtain. Julian saw her first. The color left his face so quickly it was almost funny. Miss Whitfield. Mr. Ashford. Her voice was perfectly level. She did not look at him. She looked at Nathaniel Vale. He was taller than she'd expected. She had seen him at a distance at public functions, the sort of man you noticed and then looked away from, because looking too long felt like an admission of something. Dark coat, light eyes, the particular posture of a man who had been a militia officer and hadn't quite finished being one. He was watching her now with an expression she could not immediately read. Not guilt, not quite surprise. Something more careful than either. Mr. Vale, Clara said. I believe you just agreed to $3,000. A muscle in his jaw moved. Miss Whitfield. I heard everything. She said it without apology, without the embarrassed softening that women in her position were expected to offer. I want you to know that clearly. Every word. Julian made a sound that was either apology or protest. Clara did not look at him. I imagine, Nathaniel said carefully, that this is the point at which you ask me to withdraw. No? Clara tilted her head very slightly. This is the point at which I make you a counteroffer. Silence. Julian actually took a step backward. Clara noted it without satisfaction. She had not come through that curtain for satisfaction. She had come through it because the alternative was to go home and spend the rest of her life being the woman men wagered on in other people's parlors. You want $3,000 worth of entertainment, she said. You want a story to tell at your club. A woman who can be purchased as a prop for an evening. She held his gaze. I want my brother's name cleared. Nathaniel's expression shifted. Elias Whitfield. My brother Elias Whitfield, who was accused 8 months ago of diverting militia funds in the amount of $600. Who has been unable to find work in this city or any other because that accusation followed him. Who is living on charity in a boarding house in Philadelphia because there is no justice available to men who cannot afford to purchase it. The committee ruled. The committee ruled on evidence provided by Silas Mercer, Clara said. I want you to look at different evidence. Nathaniel was very still. You have evidence. I have my father's ledgers, letters, 2 witnesses who were present at the transactions in question and who were not called before the committee. Clara's voice did not waver. Elias didn't take that money, Mr. Vale. It was taken before it ever reached him, and the accounting was arranged to make him carry the weight of it. I can show you the proof, every page of it. Julian cleared his throat. Vale, perhaps this isn't the time to— Be quiet, Julian. Nathaniel had not looked away from Clara. Something in his expression had shifted. The careful blankness had given way to something more attentive, more present. He studied her the way a man studied a document he had not expected to be complicated. And in exchange you'll attend the ball. In exchange, Clara said, I'll appear beside you at the governor's winter ball in a decent dress, smiling for as long as is necessary to satisfy whatever arrangement you made with Mr. Ashford. I'll be civil. I'll be presentable. I'll give you the story you can tell afterward. She paused. And you will take my evidence to the committee. You will use whatever influence you have with Aldrich and the others to ensure it is reviewed. You will not stop until Elias Whitfield has his name back. That's a great deal to ask for one evening. Then it's a fair exchange, Clara said, for what you were going to ask of me. The room beyond the curtain hummed with other conversations. Somewhere a woman laughed. A servant passed at the far end of the corridor with a tray of glasses, eyes carefully averted. Nathaniel Vale looked at Clara Whitfield for a long moment. She did not flinch. She had practiced not flinching for 27 years, and she was very good at it by now. "Where is this evidence?" he said finally. "In a trunk under my bed on Reed Street," Clara said. "My father kept meticulous records. He was a printer. He believed in documentation." Her hand tightened briefly on the ribbon. "He believed that if you had the truth written down eventually, someone with enough power would be willing to read it. And I'm that someone. You're the someone available tonight." She let that sit for exactly a moment. "Will you look at it?" Another silence. Julian was watching them both with the expression of a man who had lit a firecracker, expecting a small noise, and instead found himself standing next to a cannon. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "I'll look at it. Then we have a bargain." Clara did not offer her hand. She did not smile. She simply nodded once, the way her father had nodded when a business arrangement was concluded, direct, unadorned, final. "I'll have the trunk brought to your office on Monday. Good evening, Mr. Vale." She turned and walked back through the curtain into the main parlor. Her aunt was across the room near the fireplace speaking with a woman in green silk. Clara crossed to her, touched her arm, and said very quietly, "I'd like to go home, Aunt Mercy." Aunt Mercy Bell had lived 58 years and survived 2 husbands, 1 bankruptcy, and a house fire. She took one look at her niece's face and put down her glass. "Of course," she said. "Fetch my wrap." In the carriage home, Aunt Mercy waited until they were 2 blocks from the house before she spoke. "You're going to tell me what happened." "I overheard something," Clara said. She was looking out the window at the dark street. "And then I made a bargain." "With whom?" "Nathaniel Vale." The silence that followed had its own particular weight. Aunt Mercy had been a widow long enough to know the difference between dangerous silences and merely heavy ones. This was the heavy kind. "Clara, he agreed to look at Father's ledgers." Clara turned from the window. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped too tightly in her lap. "He agreed to take the evidence about Elias to the committee. In exchange, I'll appear with him at the governor's ball." Aunt Mercy was quiet for a long moment. "And you trust him?" "I trust that $3,000 is enough motivation to follow through on a bargain," Clara said. "I don't need to trust his character. I need to trust his self-interest. There's a difference between those 2 things that has ruined better women than you." "I know." Clara looked back out the window. "But Elias has been in that boarding house for 8 months, Aunt Mercy. He hasn't eaten a decent meal in 8 months. He can't write me letters anymore because he can't afford the postage." Her voice went very quiet. "Father's press is still in storage. I can't afford to retrieve it. Elias can't clear his name without influence, and influence in this city costs more than either of us has ever had." She paused. "Nathaniel Vale walked into Julian Ashford's wager tonight as if it were nothing. As if I were nothing. I intend to make it cost him something." Aunt Mercy reached across the dark carriage and pressed her hand over Clara's clasped ones. "Be careful," she said. "Not because you're wrong, because being right has a way of costing women more than it costs the men they're right about." "Yes," Clara said. "I know that too." She turned her hand over and held her aunt's. Outside, New York City moved past in the summer dark, the orange glow of street lanterns, the sound of horses, the faint noise of other people's evenings continuing without complication. Clara pressed her thumb against her father's ribbon and thought about ledgers. Nathaniel Vale did not sleep that night. He returned to his townhouse on Broadway, dismissed his manservant, poured himself a glass of brandy, and sat in his study without lighting more than 1 candle. He sat there for a long time, thinking about Clara Whitfield's face when she had stepped through that curtain. He had expected tears, or retreat, or the kind of brittle wounded dignity that women in her position sometimes deployed when they had been publicly insulted, the performance of not caring that made clear how much they cared. He had not expected ledgers. He had not expected the complete steady precision of her voice as she laid out the terms of her counteroffer, or the way she had looked at him as if she was measuring not his attractiveness or his wealth or his social standing, but his usefulness. As if she was determining whether or not he was a reliable enough instrument for the work she needed done. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at Nathaniel Vale that way. He picked up the brandy glass, set it back down without drinking, and thought about Elias Whitfield. He knew the name. He had been in the room not voting, not deciding, but present when the militia committee had reviewed Whitfield's case. $600 missing from the regimental account. Whitfield as the acting clerk. Mercer presenting documentation showing the discrepancy in Whitfield's handwriting. The committee had voted swiftly, Aldrich nodding along. Mercer watching from the side of the room with the particular attentiveness of a man observing a verdict he had already arranged. Nathaniel had thought briefly that something felt wrong. Then Mercer had hosted a very good dinner the following week, and Nathaniel had attended, and the feeling had been buried under other business. He looked at his hands. He had spent 7 years as a militia officer. He had buried his brother Thomas in the ground in upstate New York following a supply accident that should never have happened. Boxes that should have been checked weren't accounting, that should have been reviewed wasn't, and Thomas Vale had died because someone with responsibility had treated it as something other than a responsibility. He had not thought about Thomas in connection with militia accounting for 2 years. He was thinking about it now. In exchange, you will not stop until Elias Whitfield has his name back. Clara Whitfield had said it simply. Not as a plea, not as a demand. As a term of contract as precise and unadorned as a line in a ledger. This is what I am worth. This is what I require in exchange. Do we have a bargain or do we not? He had said yes before he fully understood why. Now, sitting alone in the dark, with his untouched brandy, he thought he was beginning to understand. He reached across the desk and pulled out a blank sheet of paper. He wrote 3 words at the top. Mercer. Militia accounts. Then he stopped and looked at what he had written for a long time. In 2 days, Clara Whitfield's trunk would arrive at his office. He was going to read every page of it. Monday came gray and close, the air thick with the promise of afternoon rain. The trunk arrived at Nathaniel's office at 8 in the morning, carried by a boy of about 12, who informed him that the trunk was heavy, that he had been warned to keep it dry, and that Miss Whitfield said to tell you she's numbered the documents in order and you shouldn't rearrange them. Nathaniel looked at the boy. Did she say anything else? The boy considered. She said if you lose any of them, you'll find out what a printer's daughter considers an appropriate response. Right. Nathaniel gave the boy a coin. Thank you. He locked the office door, put the brandy away, and opened the trunk. Clara had not exaggerated. Joseph Whitfield had been meticulous in the way of a man who trusted documentation over memory and evidence over impression. The trunk contained 3 years of ledgers cross-referenced and annotated in a clear, economical hand. Letters organized by date and correspondent. Receipts. 2 handwritten statements, both signed, both witnessed from men named Greaves and Farrow, who had apparently been present at a series of transactions in 1814 that the committee had never questioned. Nathaniel read for 4 hours without stopping. By noon his untouched coffee had gone cold, and he had filled 6 pages of notes. The money had not disappeared from Elias Whitfield's accounts. It had disappeared before it reached Elias Whitfield's accounts. Someone had been drawing funds from the militia supply chain for 18 months, moving them through a series of intermediary accounts, and then documenting the final shortfall in a way that pointed squarely at the last man to touch the books, which happened to be Elias, who had only been acting clerk for 11 days before the audit was called. The documentation in Mercer's name was not direct. Nothing was ever direct with men like Mercer. But there were 7 points at which the money moved through accounts that Nathaniel could trace to Mercer's banking interests, and there were 2 letters written not by Mercer, but by a man named Holt, who worked for Mercer's bank, that discussed the militia account in terms that had no innocent explanation. Nathaniel sat back in his chair. He thought about the committee dinner 2 years ago. He thought about Aldrich's easy nod. He thought about Mercer watching from the side of the room. He thought about Elias Whitfield in a Philadelphia boarding house. He thought about a woman standing behind a curtain in a blue parlor, hearing herself put up for sale, and choosing to step forward instead of away. He picked up his pen and started writing. Clara received his letter on Tuesday afternoon. It was brief. Miss Whitfield, I have read the documentation. You are correct on all material points. The shortfall originated upstream of your brother's involvement. I will need 2 weeks to prepare a proper case for the committee. I will require access to the witnesses Greaves and Farrow if they are willing. I will require your guidance on 2 points in your father's notation system that I cannot parse without clarification. You may come to my office Thursday at 10 o'clock, or I may come to you, whichever is more convenient for your circumstances. Nathaniel Vale. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it, tucked it under the printer's ribbon at her wrist, and sat down at the small writing table in the corner of Aunt Mercy's parlor. Well, Aunt Mercy said from across the room, without looking up from her mending. He read it. And he says I'm right. Clara's voice came out very even. She had expected it to waver. It didn't, but only barely. He says he needs 2 weeks and the witnesses. Aunt Mercy set down her mending. She looked at her niece across the worn parlor in the late afternoon light, at the careful posture, and the 2 still hands, and the printer's ribbon dark against Clara's wrist. You didn't believe he'd actually read it, Aunt Mercy said quietly. I believed he would look at it, Clara said. I wasn't certain he would see it. There's a difference. Yes. Clara looked down at the folded letter. There is. She picked up her pen, pulled a sheet toward her, and began to write. Mr. Vale, Thursday at 10 will suit me. I'll come to your office. Greaves is in Brooklyn. I can arrange an introduction. Farrow is more complicated. He is afraid of Mercer, which is reasonable, and will need certain assurances before he speaks to anyone official. I'll explain when I see you. On the notation system, my father marked accounts he considered reliable, with a single line underscoring the column total. Accounts he had questions about received a double line. You will want to look closely at anything doubled. Clara Whitfield. She folded it, sealed it, and called for the boy to take it to Broadway. Aunt Mercy watched her. Clara. I know, Clara said. I'll be careful. That's not what I was going to say. Aunt Mercy picked her mending back up. I was going to say your father would be proud. Clara stood very still for a moment. Then she pressed her hand over the ribbon at her wrist and went to find her coat. Thursday's meeting lasted 3 hours. Nathaniel's office was large and book-lined, the kind of room that was meant to impress people into a particular understanding of who held the authority. Clara walked in, sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be invited to sit, and put her copy of the ledger on the table between them. Page 47, she said. The double underscored accounts. Start there. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled his own copy toward him and turned to page 47. They worked through the morning without speaking except when necessary. He asked precise questions. She gave precise answers. Twice he pushed back on her interpretation of a notation, and both times she showed him the corresponding letter that confirmed it, and both times he nodded and wrote the correction in his notes without argument. He did not apologize for Julian's wager. He did not mention the ball. He did not offer her tea until 11 o'clock when he rang for it without asking her preference, and then pushed the cup toward her side of the desk. Farrow, he said. You said he's afraid. Mercer owns his mortgage. Clara wrapped her hands around the teacup. If Farrow speaks publicly and Mercer retaliates, Farrow loses his house. He has 4 children. What would change his mind? Someone with enough standing to protect him from the retaliation. Clara looked at him steadily. Someone whose word would make Mercer understand that the cost of retaliating against Farrow is higher than the cost of absorbing the testimony. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. You mean me? I mean you or someone like you. But you're the one who agreed to this bargain, so you're the one I'm asking. I could speak to Farrow directly. He'd want that in writing. Clara said. "Not a letter from your office, a formal written assurance that you will stand publicly with his account if Mercer challenges him. That commits me considerably." "Yes." She looked at him. "Does that trouble you?" Another pause. "No," Nathaniel said slowly. "It doesn't." He looked down at the ledger pages between them, at Joseph Whitfield's careful double lines, at 18 months of patient, meticulous truth recorded in a dead man's hand and carried in his daughter's trunk for 4 years because she had no other weapon. "I'll write to Pharaoh today," he said. "Whatever assurance he needs." Clara looked at him for a moment. She was trying to determine something. He could see it in her face, the careful measuring she did that was nothing like flattery and everything like assessment. "Why?" she said. "I beg your pardon. Why are you willing to do this?" She set down her teacup. "The bargain only required you to take the evidence to the committee, not to commit publicly to a witness, not to put your name behind Pharaoh's account." She was watching him carefully. "You don't owe Elias Whitfield anything beyond the terms we agreed to." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the ledger. He thought about Thomas. He thought about Mercer at the side of a room watching a verdict he had arranged. "No," he said finally. "I don't owe him anything, but I owe the truth something." He looked up. "My brother died because people with responsibility treated it carelessly. I was in that committee room when Elias Whitfield was judged. I was present, and I thought something was wrong, and I did nothing about it." He paused. "I'd like to do something about it now." Clara Whitfield looked at him across the desk, across the ledgers and the letters and 4 years of her father's careful documentation. She did not smile. She did not soften. But something in her face shifted not toward warmth exactly, but toward something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement of one person seeing another clearly for the first time. "All right," she said. "Then let's begin." The letter to Pharaoh went out Thursday evening, and by Saturday morning Silas Mercer knew something was moving. Clara didn't know this yet. She was sitting at the small table in Aunt Mercy's kitchen, working through her father's notation system for the 3rd time, checking her own cross-references against Nathaniel's notes when the knock came at the front door. She heard Aunt Mercy answer it, heard a brief exchange of voices, and then heard the door close. Aunt Mercy appeared in the kitchen doorway, holding a single white card. "A caller," she said. "He didn't wait." Clara took the card. Printed on it in the clean letterpress style of a man who paid for the best work available was the name Silas Mercer, Esquire. Below it in handwriting that was too controlled to be casual. 4 words, "I hope you're well." Clara set the card down on the table. She looked at it for a moment. "He knows," she said. "What does he know?" Aunt Mercy asked. "That something's changed." Clara pressed her thumb against the printer's ribbon at her wrist. "He doesn't know what yet. This is a warning. He wants me to understand he's watching." Aunt Mercy sat down across from her. "And are you frightened?" "Yes," Clara said without hesitation. "But being frightened and stopping are 2 different things." She picked up her pen. "Send word to Mr. Vale." The message she sent was brief. "Mercer left a card at my door this morning. He didn't knock, just left it. I believe he is aware that something has changed. Recommend we accelerate the timeline with Pharaoh." Nathaniel's reply came within the hour. "Pharaoh has agreed to meet. Monday noon, the coffee house on Fulton Street. Come with me." It was not a question. Clara noticed that. She noticed it and chose not to correct it because she had a brother in a Philadelphia boarding house, and the time for correcting Nathaniel Vale's phrasing was not right now. She wrote back, "I'll be there." Ches. Pharaoh was a small man in his 40s, with the permanently startled expression of someone who had been anxious for so long it had settled into his face as a permanent feature. He was already at the table when they arrived, turning a coffee cup in circles that had nothing to do with drinking from it. He looked at Clara when she sat down and said, "You look like your father." "I know," Clara said. "He would have been here himself if Mercer hadn't ruined him first." Pharaoh's hands went still on the cup. He looked at Nathaniel. You understand what I'm risking." "I do," Nathaniel said. "Which is why you have my written assurance that I will stand publicly with your account. My name, my word in print, if it comes to that." "Mercer has the judge," Farrow said quietly. "Not in his pocket exactly, but close enough that the difference doesn't matter." "Which judge?" Farrow hesitated. "Aldrich." Clara felt something cold move through her chest. Aldrich, who had nodded so easily at the committee verdict. Aldrich, who had been hosting the very gathering where Julian Ashford had wagered $3,000 on her dignity. She looked at Nathaniel. His face had gone very still in the way she was beginning to recognize not blankness, but concentration, the particular stillness of a man revising his map of a situation he thought he understood. "Tell me about the transactions," Nathaniel said to Farrow. "Everything you saw." Farrow told them. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Clara's notebook was full and her coffee was untouched, and the picture in her mind had sharpened from a suspicion into something with weight and edges and corners sharp enough to cut. Mercer had been pulling funds from militia supply accounts for 2 years. Not large amounts at first, small enough to be invisible against the noise of wartime procurement. Then larger, then systematic. He had used Holt, his bankman, as the intermediary, and he had arranged the final audit to land precisely when Elias Whitfield had 11 days on the books, too new to know the history, too low-born to have anyone believe his denial. "He chose Elias deliberately," Clara said. It came out flat and certain. Farrow nodded. "Your brother asked too many questions his first week," Mercer noticed. Clara said nothing. She wrote it down. She wrote every word of it down, and she kept her face absolutely steady, because if she let herself feel the full weight of it, right now, that Elias had been chosen, specifically targeted, specifically destroyed, specifically, she would not be useful. And right now, she needed to be useful, more than she needed to be honest about what she was feeling. Under the table out of sight, she pressed her thumb so hard against the printer's ribbon that she felt the edge of it leave a mark on her skin. "I'll need you to sign a formal statement," Nathaniel said to Farrow. "Witnessed and notarized. When Mercer finds out—" "He'll find out after the statement is already in committee hands," Nathaniel said. "By then it won't matter what he does to you, because the document will exist whether you recant or not. And I will make very certain that recanting looks worse for you than standing firm." Farrow looked at him for a long moment. "You're committing yourself considerably for a man who barely knew Elias Whitfield's name 2 weeks ago." "Yes?" Nathaniel said simply. "I am." Farrow looked at Clara. "And you trust him?" Clara looked across the table at Nathaniel Vale, who had read 4 hours of ledgers without being asked to care, who had written to Farrow, without being asked to go that far, who was sitting in a coffee house on Fulton Street on a Monday noon, when he could have been anywhere else doing anything more comfortable. "I trust the bargain," she said. "The rest I'm still determining." Something moved across Nathaniel's face. Not hurt. Something quieter than that. He looked back at Farrow. "Sign the statement," he said. "I'll take care of the rest." The statement was signed that afternoon. Clara carried the copy herself tucked inside her father's old satchel, pressed flat between ledger pages so it wouldn't crease. She was 2 blocks from Aunt Mercy's house when someone fell into step beside her. She didn't startle. She'd been expecting something like this since the white card on Saturday. "Miss Whitfield." Silas Mercer's voice was pleasant in the way that expensive furniture was pleasant, designed entirely for the comfort of whoever owned it, built with no consideration whatsoever for anyone else. "What a coincidence." "It isn't," Clara said without slowing down. "No," he agreed, matching her pace easily. "It isn't. I wonder if I might have a word." "I wonder the same thing about you." She kept her eyes forward. "What is it you want, Mr. Mercer? I want to understand what you think you're doing." His pleasantness didn't waver. "You're a clever young woman, Miss Whitfield. Clever enough to know that accusations against men of standing require considerable evidence and considerable allies and considerable patience, and that the people who bring such accusations, if they haven't fully considered the consequences—" He paused just long enough. sometimes find that the consequences are rather more immediate than they expected. Clara stopped walking. She turned to face him. He was well-dressed, florid, the particular kind of prosperous that came from never having missed a meal or lost a night's sleep over anything he'd done. He was smiling at her with the comfortable smile of a man who had never once in his life been the person behind the curtain. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "my father was ruined by men like you, and he died anyway. My brother has nothing. I have nothing. You have been trying to make clear to me for 20 years that women like me have everything to lose." She looked at him steadily. "You may have missed the part where I've already lost it." His smile didn't disappear, but it changed quality, became something cooler. "Vale won't protect you," he said. "He's an honorable man, which means he's a useful man to other honorable men. You are not in that category." "Not yet," Clara said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mercer." She turned and walked away. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached Aunt Mercy's door. She pressed them flat against her skirts and waited until they stopped before she went inside. She did not send word to Nathaniel about the conversation, not immediately. She thought about it and decided that if she sent word every time Mercer frightened her, she would spend this entire arrangement being frightened, and Mercer would learn that frightening her was effective, and she could not afford to teach him that. Instead, she went upstairs and spent 2 hours copying every document in her father's satchel. One copy for Nathaniel. One copy hidden in a separate place. One copy to send to Elias in Philadelphia, so that wherever else the documents were destroyed, Elias would have them. She was meticulous about it. She was her father's daughter. The public courtship, such as it was, began that Friday. Nathaniel had been expected at a political lecture at the Athenaeum for 2 weeks. Clara accompanied him. She wore her second-best dress, which was decent without being fine, and she sat beside him in the third row and listened to a congressman discuss tariff policy for 90 minutes while the entire room watched them sideways and tried to work out what it meant. It meant to Clara exactly what she had contracted appearance presence, the suggestion of a connection that served their purposes. She was civil. She answered questions from the wives of Nathaniel's acquaintances with the careful warmth of a woman who understood that social utility was its own kind of currency. She shook the right hands and said the right things and gave nothing away. On the carriage ride back, Nathaniel said, "You're very good at this." "At what?" "Performing a version of yourself that costs you nothing real." Clara looked at him. "Is that what you think I'm doing?" "Isn't it?" She considered that. "I think there's a difference between performing and protecting," she said. "What I do in those rooms isn't false. It's selective. I choose what to show and what to keep." She paused. "That's not dishonesty. That's survival." "And what are you protecting tonight?" She looked out the window. "The same thing I always am." He didn't push. She noticed that about him he asked questions and then left room for the answer or the non-answer without pressing either way. It was unusual. Most men asked questions because they wanted to hear themselves receive information. Nathaniel asked as if he was actually waiting to learn something. "Your brother," he said after a moment. "Not a question." "Always," she said. Another silence. The carriage rattled over cobblestones, and the city moved past in the summer dark. "Tell me about him," Nathaniel said. "Elias, not the case. Him." Clara turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because I'm going to stand in a committee room and argue for him, and I'd like to do it for a person rather than a set of ledger entries." Something shifted in Clara's chest. Small, almost imperceptible. Like a page turning. "He's funny," she said after a moment. "Dreadfully funny in a quiet way. He doesn't announce it. He just says things and then looks at you to see if you caught it." She paused. "He's 4 years younger than me. He used to follow me into Father's print shop when he was small and rearrange the type blocks into rude words when Father's back was turned. Father would discover them and shout, and Elias would look innocent, and I'd be the one sent from the room, because Father knew perfectly well I'd been laughing." A pause. "He wanted to study law. He was going to study law. He was saving the money when this happened." "He'll study law," Nathaniel said, "when this is done." Don't promise me things you can't guarantee. I'm not promising the outcome, he said. I'm promising I'll do everything in my power to make it possible. He looked at her directly. There's a difference. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. There is. 2 weeks in the story had already traveled far enough that Harriet Coles cornered Clara at a church social and said in the voice of a woman dispensing medicine, "My dear, I do hope you understand the nature of what's being offered. Men like Vale are not in the habit of making permanent arrangements with women in your circumstances." Clara looked at her. That's very helpful, Harriet. Thank you. I only say it because... You say it because it would distress you considerably if I failed to be distressed, Clara said pleasantly. Which is a natural enough impulse, but I'm afraid I don't have time for it today. She smiled. Give my regards to your mother. She moved away before Harriet could respond. Nathaniel had watched it from across the room. When she reached his side, he said quietly without looking at her, "Remind me never to underestimate you in a social setting." Most people make that mistake only once, Clara said. Something in his expression shifted not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to it. I believe that. They were standing close enough that she could have touched his arm without stretching for it. She didn't, but she noticed the distance, and she noticed him noticing it, and she thought that noticing the same thing at the same moment without speaking it aloud was its own kind of acknowledgement. She looked away first. The first major crack in Mercer's defense came on a Wednesday afternoon in Nathaniel's office, when the second of Greaves and Farrow's supplementary documents turned up a name neither of them had expected. It wasn't Mercer. It was Aldrich. Not deeply, in not so deep that it looked like partnership, but deep enough. 2 transactions, 18 months apart, routed through Aldrich's personal account before being moved on. Small amounts. The kind of amounts a careful man might claim were administrative errors if challenged. Clara found it. She was on the 3rd page of a supplementary ledger she'd already read twice, and the notation was easy to miss. A secondary column, one of her father's single underscores where she'd expected a double. She looked at it for a long moment, and then she said, "Nathaniel." He looked up from across the desk. This was how they worked. Now his desk between them, papers spread across every surface, 2 candles lit even in the afternoon because the light was better. She'd stopped waiting for invitations to sit down on the second Thursday. He'd stopped pretending not to watch her read. "Aldrich," she said. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. He came around the desk to look. He stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, which she did not note with any particular feeling, and noted with a great deal of particular feeling at the same time. He studied the page. His jaw tightened. "Damn," he said quietly. "The committee," Clara said. He controlled the committee. He didn't just nod along. He arranged the verdict. Nathaniel straightened. He moved away from her and stood with his back to the desk, which Clara now recognized as his thinking posture, the particular stillness of a man working through consequences. If Aldrich is implicated directly, the committee vote is compromised. Every finding from that committee in the past 3 years is potentially tainted. Including Elias's verdict, Clara said. Yes. He looked at her. This is bigger than we thought. I thought it was always big, Clara said. You're only now seeing the whole of it. He had no response to that. She hadn't expected him to. If we move too early, Nathaniel said slowly, Mercer and Aldrich will destroy what they can and claim the rest is politically motivated. We need someone above Aldrich, someone who can call a formal inquiry rather than a committee review. Who? He was quiet for a moment. The governor. Clara looked at him. The governor's winter ball, she said. Yes. You want to take this to the governor directly. At the ball I can speak to him privately, before Mercer has any indication we're going that high. He looked at her. That changes the nature of what we agreed to. How so? The ball was always part of the bargain. But I need you there with a specific purpose now. Not as the wager. He stopped. Something moved across his face, discomfort, and something else she couldn't immediately name. Not as what Julian called it, as a partner in this. Someone who knows the evidence as well as I do, in case I need to reference it in conversation. Clara was quiet for a moment. You're asking me to actually be there, not just appear to be there. Yes. She looked at him across the papers and the candlelight and the accumulated weeks of work that had built something between them without either of them designing it or naming it. All right, she said, but I want Elias notified before we go into that room. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. If something goes wrong, she repeated with enough patience in her voice that he understood she was not going to accept the reassurance. I want Elias to have the full documentation, all of it, somewhere Mercer can't reach. A pause. That's already done. Clara stopped. I beg your pardon. I sent copies to my attorney in Albany 2 weeks ago with instructions to hold them sealed. He looked at her steadily. If anything happens to either of us, they open. It seemed like the obvious precaution. She stared at him. She had spent those same 2 weeks making her own copies for that exact reason, sending one set to Elias, hiding one set under a floorboard in Aunt Mercy's back room, working alone in the early morning hours, with the sense of a woman who had never once in her life been able to rely on someone else thinking 3 steps ahead for her. And he had already done it. 2 weeks ago. You didn't tell me, she said. You didn't ask. He paused. I should have told you. It was your documents, your risk. You had the right to know. Something in his voice went quieter. I'm sorry. The apology landed differently than she expected. Not defensive, not performative, just direct. Yes, she said after a moment. You should have. He nodded. He didn't excuse it or explain it further. He simply accepted the correction and moved on. And that small, plain acknowledgement of a wrong without argument, cracked something in Clara's chest that she had not been aware was still intact. She looked down at the ledger. She looked at her father's handwriting, careful and clear and stubbornly present, even after 4 years and a grave. 2 weeks until the ball, she said. Yes. Then we have 2 weeks to make certain we have everything. She pulled the ledger back toward her. Page 47. Your father's notation, the doubled accounts. I want to go through every one again. We've been through them 3 times. Then we'll go through them a 4th, Clara said. Because the first time you read something, you see what you expect to see. The 4th time, you see what's actually there. Nathaniel looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled his chair around to her side of the desk, sat down and opened his copy to page 47. Their shoulders were almost touching. Neither of them moved away. It was Aunt Mercy who noticed first. Clara came home one evening, near the end of the 2nd week, and found her aunt at the parlor table with 2 cups of tea already poured, which meant Aunt Mercy had been watching for her to come down the street. Clara sat down and wrapped her hands around her cup. You're different, Aunt Mercy said. I'm tired. That too. But that's not what I mean. Aunt Mercy watched her niece with the particular attention of a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and reached the age of 58 by paying close attention to what people didn't say. You came in tonight the way you used to come in from the print shop when you were 14. When your father had given you a problem to work on, and you were already thinking about it 3 hours before you got there. Clara was quiet. He's a good man, Aunt Mercy said. I won't say more than that because I know you already know it, and I know you know what it cost you to admit it. It doesn't cost me anything, Clara said. I'm not admitting anything. Clara? It's a bargain, Clara said. It was always a bargain. Aunt Mercy looked at her with great tenderness and great exasperation in equal measure. My darling girl, she said. Bargains don't keep a man up until midnight reading ledgers he had no obligation to read. Clara said nothing. She drank her tea. She thought about Nathaniel at his desk on Thursday the quiet. I'm sorry that didn't reach for anything more than it was. She thought about his shoulder almost touching hers over page 47. She thought about how much it would cost her when this ended, when the ball came and went, and the bargain was discharged, and they went back to being strangers on opposite sides of the social distance that had always existed between men like Nathaniel Vale and women like Clara Whitfield. "Don't," she said quietly. Aunt Mercy put down her cup. "All right." They sat together in the quiet evening, and Clara pressed her thumb to the printer's ribbon at her wrist and thought about truth and about the particular way truth had of arriving when you were not ready for it. The night before, everything changed. Nathaniel came to the door himself. Not a letter. Not a message through the boy. He came to the door at 7 in the evening and asked for Miss Whitfield, and Clara came down to find him standing in the narrow front hallway with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do before. "What's happened?" she said immediately. "Julian's letter," he said. "It's going to be published." The bottom dropped out of her stomach. She gripped the banister. "What letter?" "The letter he wrote to his cousin in Boston 3 weeks ago, describing the wager." Nathaniel's face was very controlled. "His cousin showed it to someone who showed it to the editor of the Courier. It's in tomorrow's edition." Clara stood very still. "The original wager," she said slowly. "In print?" "Yes." "Your name?" "Yes." "And mine?" "Yes." He met her eyes. "Clara, I want you to hear it from me first. Whatever you read tomorrow, whatever you feel about it, I want you to have heard it from me tonight." She looked at him. This man who had read 4 hours of ledgers, who had written to Pharaoh without being asked who had sent copies to Albany 2 weeks ago, and not told her who had said "I'm sorry" without armor around it, without. She looked at him and felt the hot, clarifying wave of something she could not afford to feel, because tomorrow morning the entire city of New York was going to read that Nathaniel Vale had wagered $3,000 on bringing the printer's spinster daughter to a ball, and she was going to have to decide what kind of woman she was when the world reminded her again loudly, publicly in print, exactly what she was worth to them. "Go home, Mr. Vale," she said. His jaw tightened. "Clara, go home." Her voice did not waver. "I need to think." He stood in her hallway for a moment longer, hat in his hands, and in the quiet of it, she saw something in his face she had not seen before. Not guilt, which she'd expected, but grief. The particular grief of a man who had done a wrong he cannot undo, and has to stand in front of the person. It hurt, and accept that standing there changes nothing. "I know," he said quietly. "I know." He put his hat on. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. "Whatever you decide tomorrow," he said without turning around. "The committee, the evidence, all of it goes forward. Whatever you decide about the rest." He left. Clara stood in the empty hallway for a long time. Then she walked upstairs, sat down at her writing table, and read the newspaper before it was even printed. She didn't have to. She already knew exactly what it would say. The Courier hit the streets at 6 in the morning. Clara was already awake. She had not slept. She had sat at her writing table through the night with her father's ledger open in front of her and a blank sheet of paper beside it, and she had written nothing on the blank sheet and read nothing in the ledger. And when the first gray light came through the window, she heard the paper boy's call 2 streets over, and she knew without moving that it was already done. Aunt Mercy brought the paper upstairs without being asked. She set it on the table and left without a word, which was its own kind of mercy. Clara looked at the front page for a long moment before she picked it up. The headline was not unkind exactly. The Courier was not in the business of outright cruelty. It preferred the refined cruelty of implication, the well-placed fact that required no editorial commentary to wound. The headline read, "A Gentleman's Wager Society's latest arrangement raises questions of honor and motive." Below it, a summary of Julian's letter. The wager, the amount, the terms, Nathaniel Vale's name, her name, the words Julian had used, spinster printer's daughter, no prospects, no family connections left worth mentioning, quoted directly framed in the elegant typography of a publication that understood exactly what it was doing. Clara read it once. Then she set it face down on the table. She sat very still for a moment. Outside, the city was waking up cartwheels, a dog, a woman calling something from a window 2 houses down. The ordinary machinery of a morning that had no idea it had just done something to her. She picked up her pen. She wrote the letter to Nathaniel in 12 minutes flat, which was the fastest she had written anything since the night she'd drafted the emergency letter to Elias, telling him the verdict had come down against him. Speed was not accuracy, but sometimes speed was what the moment required, the direct line from what you felt to what you needed to say before you talked yourself into softness. Mr. Vale, I have read the paper. I expect you have as well. I am writing to inform you that the terms of our arrangement, as I understood them, required your discretion regarding the original nature of the wager. The publication of Julian's letter makes that discretion impossible, regardless of your intent. I am releasing you from any obligation to appear at the governor's ball with me on your arm, and I am likewise withdrawing my own obligation to attend. Regarding the evidence and the committee, you gave me your word that it proceeds regardless. I am holding you to that word. Elias's name is not a casualty of whatever this morning requires. I will not be available for correspondence today. Clara Whitfield. She sealed it. She sent it with the boy before Aunt Mercy had finished making breakfast. Then she went back upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and finally privately let herself feel it. Not the humiliation. She had been humiliated before, and she knew its texture, hot and public and oddly clarifying, like a cold wind that stripped everything away and left only what was solid. She had survived humiliation. What she felt now was different. It was smaller and worse. It was the particular grief of having begun to trust something, and discovering that the thing you trusted had roots in something rotten, that the ground you had tested and found firm was built on the same rotten timber as everything else. I'm sorry, he had said the night before. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes. He had come to warn her. He had stood in her hallway with his hat in his hands and told her before the paper told her, and he had said, whatever you decide, the committee goes forward. He had done the decent thing. The decent thing did not change what the paper said. The decent thing did not unwrite Julian's words or undo the original moment in the parlor when Nathaniel Vale had heard her name put up for $3,000 and said without hesitation, done. She could not sort out what she owed him from what she felt, and that the inability to sort it was the most frightening thing of all. Aunt Mercy appeared in the doorway with a cup of tea, and the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between grief that needed company and grief that needed space. Do you want me to stay? She asked. No, Clara said. Then, yes. Sit down. Aunt Mercy sat. He knew it was wrong, Clara said. From the beginning, he knew it was wrong when he said yes to Julian, and he did it anyway. Yes, Aunt Mercy said, and then he tried to make it right. He read the ledgers, he wrote to Pharaoh, he sent copies to Albany. Clara's voice was level, but it was costing her something to keep it that way. He tried to make it right. Yes. That doesn't make the first thing not have happened. No, Aunt Mercy said quietly. It doesn't. He has my brother's evidence, Clara said. He has my silence, or he had it before this morning. He will not have my face beside his while that room laughs at me. Her voice went very steady, the way it went steady when she was deciding something. I won't go to the ball. Aunt Mercy looked at her niece at the straight back and the 2 still hands, and the printer's ribbon gone dark against her wrist from how hard she'd been pressing it. Elias, she said softly. Nathaniel said it goes forward regardless. Clara's jaw tightened. I believe him. About that. You believe him about that, Aunt Mercy repeated. But not about the rest. I don't know what the rest is. Clara looked at her hands. And I can't work it out today with half of New York reading about me over their breakfast tables. Aunt Mercy reached across and covered Clara's hands with both of hers. She didn't say anything. She just held them. After a long while, Clara said very quietly, "I miss him, Father. I miss him every single day. But I miss him particularly today, because he would have known what to say." "He would have said the press doesn't care who's angry," Aunt Mercy said. "He would have said it prints the truth, and lets the truth do the work." Clara made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He said that about everything, because it applied to everything." Aunt Mercy squeezed her hands. "The truth is still in those ledgers, Clara. Today's paper doesn't change what's in those ledgers." "No," Clara said. "It doesn't." She sat with that for a moment. Then she straightened her back, set her shoulders, and picked up her tea. Nathaniel received the letter at 8 in the morning. He read it standing up, which was how he read things he expected to be difficult. He read it twice. Then he set it on his desk, walked to the window, and stood looking at Broadway for a long time. The street below was already busy. The city didn't pause for anyone's private reckonings, and he watched it move with the detached attention of a man trying to locate himself in time and space. He had known this was coming. He had gone to her door the night before precisely because he'd known this was coming, and he had wanted with a desperation he hadn't recognized in himself until he was already standing in her narrow hallway for her to hear it from him first. As if that changed something. As if the order of the wound mattered. His man appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Ashford is downstairs, sir." "Tell him I'm not available." "He says it's urgent." "Tell him I'm not available." Nathaniel turned from the window. "Send word to Greaves that I need to meet today, and get me Aldrich's schedule for the remainder of the week." His man hesitated. "And Mr. Ashford?" "He can wait in the street until he understands the word unavailable," Nathaniel said. "Or he can go home. His choice." The man disappeared. Nathaniel sat down at his desk and looked at Clara's letter. He had known it would say exactly what it said, and it still hit him somewhere specific, not his pride, which would have been easier to manage, but somewhere lower and quieter and less familiar. The place where he'd begun to keep track of her notebook, the particular way she moved to page 47 without hesitation. The "all right, then let's begin," that had come after his apology 2 weeks ago. He picked up his pen. He wrote one line on a sheet of paper, folded it, and sent it to Reed Street. "The committee. Wednesday. Everything moves forward as I gave my word. N.V." He did not write anything else. He had learned in 2.5 weeks of working alongside Clara Whitfield that saying less was almost always more honest. Then he pulled the Mercer files toward him, opened them to the section on Aldrich, and got to work. The city had opinions about the newspaper story, which Clara discovered in the following 48 hours without needing to leave Aunt Mercy's house. The opinions came to her in the form of cards, which she did not answer, and neighbors who spoke loudly in the street below the window, and Harriet Coles, who appeared at the door on Tuesday, and had to be turned away by Aunt Mercy, with the particular gracious finality that Mercy Bell deployed when she wanted someone to understand they were not welcome without being able to quote her on it later. The opinions divided themselves roughly into 2 camps. The first camp believed that Clara had engineered the entire arrangement to capture Nathaniel Vale, that the business about Elias was a pretext, and that the sort of woman who overheard private conversations and inserted herself into gentlemen's wagers was the sort of woman who had manufactured this notoriety for her own advancement. The second camp believed that Clara was a pathetic figure to be pitied, that Vale had clearly been manipulated into an obligation by a desperate woman, and that the kindest thing anyone could do was not to mention her name at all. Clara was aware of both camps. She found the first one insulting and the second one worse. On Tuesday evening she wrote to Elias. Not about the newspaper, she hadn't told him about the newspaper, and did not intend to, because Elias would read it as his fault, and carry that weight on top of everything else he was already carrying, and she was not going to let Silas Mercer's sins become her brother's self-blame. She wrote instead about the investigation, about Pharaoh's statement, about Nathaniel's plan for the committee. She wrote, "It's moving, Elias. Hold on a little longer." She sealed it and sent it and pressed her thumb to the ribbon at her wrist and sat in the quiet of the evening thinking about Wednesday. Wednesday arrived the way consequential days often did. Unremarkably a little gray, with the ordinary smell of August and the ordinary sounds of a city that didn't know it was about to watch something important happen. Nathaniel was in the committee chamber at 9 in the morning. He had requested the emergency session through channels that cost him 3 days and 2 substantial debts in favors, because calling a formal committee review outside the normal schedule required either extreme urgency or substantial political capital, and Nathaniel had used both to get this meeting. He had not told Aldrich the specific nature of the evidence. He had said only that new information had emerged regarding the Whitfield militia account finding, and that it required immediate review. Aldrich was seated at the head of the table when Nathaniel walked in. So were 4 other committee members, and in the chair at Aldrich's right hand, which was not a committee chair, which had no business being occupied by anyone who was not a committee member or a formally called witness, sat Silas Mercer. Nathaniel stopped in the doorway for 1/2 of a second. Then he walked in and sat down, arranged his papers, and said, "Gentlemen, thank you for your time." Aldrich's expression was precisely calibrated. Not guilty men like Aldrich had stopped looking guilty so long ago that the expression had atrophied from disuse. Careful. The careful expression of a man who had been warned and had taken his precautions. "Mr. Vale, I wasn't aware you'd invited Mr. Mercer." "I didn't," Nathaniel said pleasantly. "Mr. Mercer appears to have invited himself, which is interesting. I would have thought a man with no formal connection to the Whitfield matter would have no particular reason to be present." He looked at Mercer directly. "Unless there is a connection I'm not yet aware of." Mercer smiled the smile of a man who had survived a great many rooms. "I have an interest in ensuring the integrity of committee proceedings, as does any concerned citizen." "Wonderful," Nathaniel said. "Then you'll appreciate what I'm about to present." He opened the first folder. "Gentlemen, I am requesting that the committee's finding in the Whitfield militia account matter be formally reviewed on the basis of newly available evidence indicating that the account discrepancy in question did not originate with Elias Whitfield, but rather was introduced systematically through a series of upstream transactions beginning in 1814. Aldrich's careful expression did not change. "That's a significant claim. I have significant evidence." Nathaniel laid the first ledger page on the table. "This is a copy. The originals are held by my attorney in Albany in sealed trust. The accounting documented here shows 7 separate transactions moving through accounts with demonstrable ties to a single banking interest." He placed the second document. "This is a signed and notarized statement from Robert Farrow, who was personally present at 2 of those transactions, describing what he witnessed." The temperature in the room changed. Not obviously, just slightly. The quality of the silence. Mercer was very still. "Mr. Farrow," Aldrich said carefully, "is a man of good standing," Nathaniel said. "A family man with 4 children and a mortgage in good order and no record of dishonesty in 20 years of business. His statement is specific, dated, and corroborated at 3 points by independent documentation." He placed the third document. "And this," he paused for exactly 1 beat, "is a record of 2 transactions routed through a personal account that this committee will recognize." He placed it on the table and turned it so Aldrich could see it clearly. The room went so quiet you could hear the street below. Aldrich looked at the document. His face went through 3 changes in the space of 2 seconds, recognition calculation, and then the decision to be very, very still. Mercer made a sound, small, controlled, a man recalibrating. "These documents could be fabricated," Nathaniel said. "They're copies of records held in sealed trust with my attorney and can be verified against the originals at any time. The attorney's seal and signature are on every page." He looked at Mercer. "I anticipated that objection." "Vale," Aldrich began, "the finding against Elias Whitfield is invalid." Nathaniel said, "Because it was obtained on the basis of evidence that was selectively presented to conceal prior misconduct. I am requesting that the committee formally vacate the finding, issue a written record clearing Whitfield's name, and refer the full matter of the account discrepancy for independent review." He closed his folder. "Today." The silence stretched. Then one of the other committee members, a man named Carver, who had served with Nathaniel's regiment, and had no particular connection to Mercer or Aldrich, said quietly, "I'd like to review the Faro statement." Nathaniel slid it across the table. Aldrich had not moved. He was looking at the document in front of him with the expression of a man counting his options and finding the number very small. Mercer pushed back his chair. "This is politically motivated. The evidence isn't," Carver said without looking up from the statement. "Mercer," Nathaniel said, "I'd recommend you remain seated. If you leave this room before the committee votes, it will be noted in the record." Mercer looked at him. For the first time, the pleasantness was entirely absent. What was underneath it was colder and harder and considerably more honest. "You have no idea," he said quietly, "what you've done." "I've cleared an innocent man's name," Nathaniel said. "I'm relatively comfortable with that." The vote was 3-2 in favor of vacating the finding with Aldrich, abstaining in a silence so loud it was essentially a confession. Carver signed the formal record himself, handed it to Nathaniel, and said in a voice pitched for Nathaniel's ears only, "You've made enemies today." "I had them before," Nathaniel said. "Now I have them for a reason." He walked out of the committee chamber into the August afternoon with the signed record in his hand and stood in the street and breathed. He had not allowed himself to think about Clara during the preceding hour. He had needed to be completely present in that room, and thinking about Clara was the kind of thing that made him less present, had been making him less present for 2 weeks, which was itself information he had not fully processed. He thought about her now, about the letter on his desk with its 12-minute precision, the complete steady withdrawal of a woman who had been wounded before and knew exactly how to stop the bleeding. "He will not have my face beside his while they laugh." She was right. She was entirely right. Whatever he had built in those weeks of ledgers and candlelight and almost touching at page 47, he had built it on top of a wrong he had committed in a parlor in August. And she was right not to pretend that one could simply overwrite the other. He reached into his coat. He took out Julian Ashford's original letter of wager, the physical note written in Julian's careless hand, which Julian had given Nathaniel as documentation of the bet the morning after the party. He had been carrying it for weeks. He had been meaning to do something with it. He had known for the past 10 days what that something was. He walked to his bank. The clerk at the bank looked at Nathaniel Vale's withdrawal request and then looked at Nathaniel Vale and said in the politely neutral tone of a man paid to be neutral, "The full 3,000, sir." "The full 3,000, Nathaniel confirmed. "And I'll need a receipt made out to the New York Militiamen's Relief Fund attention. Mrs. Carver at the Charitable Society on Chambers Street." The clerk wrote it out. Nathaniel signed it. He took the receipt and he walked to Julian Ashford's house on the east side, and he knocked on the door, and when Julian appeared looking pale and unhappy in the way of a man who had spent the week reading about his own letter in the newspaper, Nathaniel held out the receipt. Julian took it, read it, looked up. "The 3,000, Nathaniel said, "donated, in full, to the widows and children of militiamen killed in the supply accident of 1813. He paused. "My brother was in that accident. The money should have been there for those families 2 years ago. Consider the wager discharged." Julian opened his mouth. "Don't," Nathaniel said. "There's nothing you can say today that I want to hear." He left. Hug. Clara received the news of the committee vote from a source she did not expect, the paperboy who appeared at Aunt Mercy's door at 2 in the afternoon with the afternoon edition of the Courier and the wide-eyed energy of someone delivering something consequential. The headline on the afternoon edition was not about a wager. It was about a committee. Formal review ordered in militia account case, Whitfield, finding vacated. Clara read it standing in the doorway. The boy was still there waiting because the story didn't end at the headline, and he seemed to understand that. She read the full account. The committee session. Faro's statement. The independent documentation. The vote. 3-2, the paper said, with Committee Chairman Aldrich abstaining on grounds of a potential conflict of interest recently brought to his attention, the nature of which this reporter understands to be the subject of further inquiry. Aldrich. In print. 3 sentences from being named. Clara put her hand on the doorframe. She had been certain as she had been about anything, that this would happen eventually. She had built the entire structure of the bargain on her certainty that the evidence was there, that it was readable, that it was true. She had not been uncertain about the evidence. She had been uncertain about whether anyone with enough power would be willing to read it. She thought about her father's voice. A press doesn't care who's angry. It prints the truth and lets the truth do the work. Someone had read it. Nathaniel Vale had read it. She became aware that she was gripping the doorframe hard enough that her knuckles had gone white. She let go deliberately, one finger at a time. "Thank you," she said to the paper boy. She gave him 2 coins instead of 1. He left at a run. She went inside. She sat down in the kitchen, and she read the paper from beginning to end twice, slowly. Then she picked up her pen and wrote to Elias. "It's done. It's done, Elias. Come home."
Jamasi.
Nathaniel's note arrived an hour later. Not long this time, shorter even than the 2-line note of Wednesday morning. The finding is vacated. The relief fund has the 3,000. None of this was conditional on anything else. I am not writing to ask for anything. N.V. Clara stared at the note. The relief fund. The $3,000. The widows and children of dead militiamen. She thought about the night in the parlor. $3,000, Dunn said in the same tone as ordering brandy. She thought about what it cost to return that money, not financially, but in terms of what it said about a man's understanding of his own wrong. It wasn't an apology. It was something harder and more honest than an apology. It was consequence. It was a man looking at what he had done carelessly and deciding that carelessness required something real in return, not just words. Aunt Mercy appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked at Clara's face. "Well," she said. "He cleared Elias," Clara said. "And he gave the 3,000 to the militiamen's relief fund." Aunt Mercy was quiet for a moment. Then she said very gently, "Clara." "I know," Clara said. "What do you know?" Clara looked down at the note in her hand, at the brief, careful lines of it, at the "I am not writing to ask for anything" at the end, which was, she thought, the most honest thing he had ever put in writing to her, which meant it might be the most honest thing he had ever said. "I know," she said slowly, "that 2 things can be true at the same time. That what he did in that parlor was wrong, and that what he did in that committee room was right." She looked up. "I know that being right today doesn't erase being wrong in August. And I know," her voice went quieter, "that he knows that too. And he went and did the right thing anyway, without asking me first. Without asking me to forgive him. Without making the justice conditional on anything." "Yes," Aunt Mercy said softly. "He did." Clara folded the note. She pressed it flat. She held it in both hands and sat in the kitchen in the August afternoon and felt the particular complicated weight of a woman who has been watching someone very carefully for long enough to know exactly who they are. "The ball is in 4 days, she said. "Yes," Aunt Mercy said. "I told him I wouldn't go." "You did?" "I was right to tell him that." "You were." Clara looked at the note. She looked at the printer's ribbon on her wrist. She thought about her father, and about Elias on a train from Philadelphia, and about Nathaniel Vale, standing in a committee room, armed with her father's ledgers, and a militiaman's testimony, and $3,000 of his own consequence. She thought about a woman who had stepped through a curtain in August, because the alternative was to go home and spend the rest of her life being the woman men wagered on in other people's parlors. She thought about what kind of woman she intended to be. Not for Nathaniel Vale, for herself. For the 37 years of living she still had ahead of her, and for the print shop she was going to open someday, and for Elias, who was coming home. She set the note down on the table. "I need to think," she said. Aunt Mercy nodded. She poured 2 cups of tea and sat down, and did not say another word. The afternoon light came through the window, and the city moved outside. And somewhere across Manhattan, in a townhouse on Broadway, a man who had wagered $3,000 on a woman's humiliation sat alone in his study and waited without asking which was the only right thing left he knew how to do. Clara pressed her thumb to the printer's ribbon. She thought. Elias Whitfield arrived on a Thursday. Clara was at the front door before the carriage stopped because she had been watching the street from the upstairs window for 2 hours. She went down the steps and had her arms around her brother before he had fully straightened from climbing out. And for a moment, neither of them said anything at all because there was nothing that words were adequate for. He was thinner. She felt that immediately, the way the shoulder blades moved under her hands, the unfamiliar sharpness of a frame that had been surviving rather than living. His coat was brushed clean, but worn at the elbows. He smelled like a long journey and soap, and something underneath it that was simply Elias, the particular Elias, who had rearranged type blocks into rude words, and looked innocent, and laughed silently, while Clara took the blame. She held on and did not let go until she was ready. "Clara," he said into her shoulder. His voice was rough. "I know," she said. "I know. You're home. I read your letter." He pulled back to look at her. His eyes were red at the edges. "You said it was done. I didn't let myself believe it until I was on the road." "Believe it," she said. "It's in the committee record. Your name is clear." He looked at her face for a long moment. He knew her, had always known her better than most people bothered to, and she watched him read everything she hadn't written in the letter, the weeks of work, the bargain, the cost of it. "Tell me," he said. "Later," she said. "Come inside and eat something. You look like Philadelphia tried to keep you and forgot to feed you first." He almost laughed. "That's not too far wrong." She told him over dinner. Not everything. Not the curtain. Not what Julian had said in the parlor. Not the particular words, "spinster printer's daughter, no prospects." Those were details that would wound him without helping him, and Clara had spent enough time around unnecessary wounds to know the difference between honesty and harm. She told him about the evidence, the ledgers, Pharaoh, the committee. She told him about Nathaniel Vale in the terms that were true and stripped of complication, that he had read the document seriously, that he had taken the evidence forward, that he had done what he said he would do. Elias listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. He ate steadily and listened, and when she finished, he sat quietly for a moment with his fork resting against his plate. "And this Vale," he said carefully. "Where does he stand now?" "I don't know," Clara said, which was not entirely honest. She knew where Nathaniel stood. She simply hadn't decided what to do about it yet. Elias looked at her. He was 23 years old and had just spent 8 months in a Philadelphia boarding house having his character questioned by a city that had decided he was guilty before the ink was dry. And yet the thing that was currently in his eyes was not self-pity or exhaustion, but the particular sharp attention of a younger brother who had been watching his sister navigate a world designed to diminish her since they were children together in their father's print shop. "Clara," he said. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything yet." "You have a face for saying things without words. Always have." She picked up her fork. "Eat." "He donated the $3,000 to the relief fund." "I know." "That's not nothing." "I know that too." She looked at her plate. "I'm aware of what it is and what it isn't, Elias. I don't require assistance sorting it out." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "He used your name as a wager." "Yes, and he cleared my name through a hostile committee and gave away the money he would have won doing it." "Yes." "Those are 2 different men," Elias said. "Or one man who changed." Clara looked up at him. "I know. Which one do you owe the benefit of the doubt?" She looked at her brother, at the thinness of him, at the worn elbows of his coat, at the 8 months of an innocent man's destroyed future sitting behind his eyes, and she thought about the particular cruelty of easy answers. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm working on it." The governor's ball was the following evening. Clara had not sent word to Nathaniel. She had not agreed to attend. She had not told anyone, including Aunt Mercy, what she intended to do, because she had not decided until the morning of the ball itself, when she woke at 6 and lay in the dark and listened to the city and thought about her father. Joseph Whitfield had been a printer. He had run his press in Lower Manhattan for 22 years, printing pamphlets and broadsides and legal notices and the occasional political argument for whoever needed words put to paper. He had believed in documentation because he had believed that truth without a record was just a story that powerful men could edit. He had died ruined because a man like Mercer had decided that a press that told inconvenient truths was a press worth silencing. Clara lay in the dark and thought about what her father would have done on the morning of the governor's ball. He would have gone. Not to please anyone. Not because a man had earned it. Because the room where the governor stood was a room where things could be said and witnessed and made part of the public record, and Joseph Whitfield had never once turned away from a room like that. She got up, she dressed, she went downstairs. Elias was already in the kitchen, which surprised her. He had been sleeping 12 hours a night since he arrived, catching up on 8 months of insufficient rest, and she had not expected him before 9. He was dressed. His coat was the better of the two he'd brought from Philadelphia. "I'm coming with you," he said. Clara looked at him. "I haven't said I'm going." "You're dressed before 7 on the morning of the governor's ball." He poured her tea. "You're going." She sat down and picked up the cup. "You're not strong enough for a whole evening." "I'm strong enough for the part that matters." He sat across from her. "You're not walking into that room alone, Clara. Not after everything. I don't care if I fall asleep standing up at 10 o'clock. She looked at her brother, at the stubborn line of his jaw that was exactly their father's jaw. "All right," she said, "but you eat breakfast first." Aunt Mercy lent Clara the blue silk dress that had been waiting in the upstairs wardrobe since Aunt Mercy's second husband's funeral, when she'd had it made for a reception and then decided she was too tired of being decorative to wear it. It fit Clara almost exactly, which Aunt Mercy called fate, and Clara called good luck. Clara stood at the mirror and looked at herself in blue silk with her father's ribbon at her wrist and thought, this is what it costs. This is the price of walking into a room like that. You have to look like you can afford to be there. She straightened her back. She lifted her chin. She met her own eyes in the glass and held them. "You're ready," Aunt Mercy said from the doorway. "I don't know about ready," Clara said, "but I'm going." They arrived at the governor's residence at 8:30. The entrance hall was already full. The rustling, perfumed, elaborately indifferent full of New York's most important people, doing their best to look as though they hadn't carefully planned every detail of their presence. Clara walked in with Elias at her side, and she felt the room register them the way rooms registered things that disrupted the expected arrangement. She felt the looks. She had felt looks her entire adult life, and she had learned to treat them as whether unpleasant, sometimes severe, but essentially impersonal. Weather did not have opinions about you. Weather simply happened. She kept her back straight and her chin level and walked beside her brother, who walked beside her with the careful, deliberate steadiness of a man who understood that every step he took in this room was a statement. "They're staring," he said without moving his lips much. "They always stare," Clara said. "Ignore it. Easy for you to say. You've had more practice." "Much more," she agreed. "Also, your cravat is slightly crooked." "I know," he said. "I couldn't fix it in the carriage. Don't tell anyone." Despite everything, despite the stares and the silk dress and the 8 months of her brother's destroyed life, and the $3,000 and the wager and all the weight of everything that had brought them to this room, Clara almost laughed. She caught it. She pressed it back into a half-smile. But Elias felt her shoulder shake slightly against his, and he pressed his arm briefly closer to his body, squeezing her arm without comment, and they walked into the governor's ball together. Chashto. She saw Nathaniel 20 minutes later. He was across the room near the window speaking with Carver. He was wearing his good coat, dark, well-cut, the kind of coat that announced nothing because it didn't need to. He had his back partially toward her, and he was listening to Carver with the still focused attention she recognized from 2 weeks of working across desks from him. He didn't see her. Not immediately. Carver did. His eyes moved to her and then moved back to Nathaniel, and he said something brief. Nathaniel turned. For a moment across the crowded room they simply looked at each other. Clara held his gaze. She was not going to be the one who looked away first. That was not pride exactly, it was something simpler. It was the acknowledgement that she had come into this room on her own terms with her brother on her arm, and she was not going to spend any part of this evening performing uncertainty for an audience that was already watching too closely. Nathaniel's expression went through several things in rapid succession. She was too far away to read them precisely. But the last one, the one that settled, looked remarkably like relief. He excused himself from Carver. He crossed the room toward her. Clara stayed where she was. She did not move toward him. She let him cross the distance because the direction of the crossing mattered, and both of them knew it. He stopped in front of her. He looked at Elias first. "Mr. Whitfield." Elias looked at him for a moment with the particular assessment of a younger brother who had been hearing about this man for 4 days and had formed very precise opinions. "Mr. Vale," Elias said. And then slowly he extended his hand. Nathaniel shook it. Neither of them said anything else, but something passed between them, the particular compact of two people who shared a debt and were determining its nature. Then Nathaniel looked at Clara. "You came," he said. "I came," she agreed. "With my brother." "Yes." He looked at Elias briefly again. "That's right. That's exactly right." She had not expected him to say that. Something in her chest shifted. "I need to speak with the governor," Nathaniel said, "before the evening goes much further. There are things that need to be said while the committee vote is still fresh." He paused. "I'd like you to be nearby when I do." "Not beside you," Clara said. "Nearby." "Understood." His voice was level, not wounded. He had heard the distinction clearly and was not going to argue it. "Will you stay in the room?" "For now," she said. "Yes." The conversation with the governor happened in a side room off the main hall, which the governor's secretary arranged with the smooth efficiency of a man paid to make things happen without appearing to make them happen. Nathaniel went in. Carver went in as corroboration. Clara and Elias stayed in the hallway outside, which was near enough to hear voices but not words. Elias stood with his shoulder against the wall and his arms folded and said quietly, "He's going to tell the governor about Aldrich." "Yes," Clara said. "That takes nerve." "Yes. Aldrich is connected to half the political machinery in this state," Clara said. "I know." She looked at the closed door. "Nathaniel knows too." Elias was quiet for a moment. "You trust him?" "I trust his judgment," Clara said carefully. "In there. About this, yes. And the rest." Clara pressed her thumb to the ribbon. "The rest is complicated." The door opened. Nathaniel came out first. His expression was controlled, but his jaw was set in the particular way she associated with a man who had said something costly and was not regretting it. Carver came out behind him, looking like a man who had watched something consequential happen and was still processing it. Nathaniel looked at Clara. "He'll call for an independent review, full scope. Mercer's accounts, Aldrich's involvement, the militia transactions going back to 1813. He paused. "Aldrich is going to resign, probably within the week." The word landed in the hallway like a stone dropped in still water. Clara looked at him. "Aldrich. Aldrich." His voice was flat and certain. "The governor had more information than we knew. We weren't the first people to bring him questions about that committee. We were just the first people to bring him documented answers." He looked at her directly. "It's done, Clara. All of it." She stood very still. 8 months of Elias in Philadelphia. 4 years of her father's ledgers in a trunk. $3,000. The curtain. The parlor. The wager. All of it. All the weight of it. And it was done. It was actually completely, irrevocably done. Elias made a sound beside her. Small and ragged, quickly controlled. Clara reached without looking and found his arm and held it. "Thank you," Elias said to Nathaniel. His voice was not entirely steady. There aren't words for what this—" "You don't need words," Nathaniel said quietly. "The record is enough." What happened next was not planned. Clara learned this later from 3 separate people who witnessed it from 3 different angles, and each described it with the slightly stunned quality of people who had seen something they hadn't expected to see from a man of Nathaniel Vale's position. He went back into the main ballroom. The room was at full capacity. Now the governor's ball in its natural prime, the music, the candles, the important people doing important things with their faces and their clothing, and their careful arrangement of who stood near whom. Nathaniel walked to the center of the room. He did not ask for attention. He did not need to. He was Nathaniel Vale, and he had the particular quality of stillness that draws eyes without demanding them. The room's noise lowered without quite stopping. He said in a voice pitched to carry without shouting, "I owe this room a correction." The room went quiet. 3 months ago, Nathaniel said, "I accepted a wager from Julian Ashford. The terms of that wager used Miss Clara Whitfield's name and her circumstances as a subject of entertainment. I accepted it without adequate thought about what it said about my character or my regard for another person's dignity." He paused. "That was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I did it, and I did it anyway, and there is no explanation for that which reflects well on me." Someone across the room cleared their throat. Nobody else moved. "Miss Whitfield is in this room tonight," Nathaniel said, "with her brother whose name was cleared this week before the state committee cleared because Miss Whitfield spent 4 years protecting evidence that the rest of us were not willing to look at. She is not in this room as anyone's prize or anyone's project or the punchline of anyone's wager." His voice was level and clear and entirely without performance. "She is in this room because she earned the right to be here. Miss Clara Whitfield was never the prize of a bet. She was the only honorable person in that parlor in August. She was likely the only honorable person in that room." Silence. Then from across the ballroom, a single pair of hands began to applaud. Clara recognized Carver without looking. Others followed, not a tide exactly, not the roar of a crowd moved to enthusiasm, but the careful, considered applause of people who had just watched something genuine happen and were not entirely sure what to do with it. Clara stood in the doorway of the ballroom with her brother's arm under her hand and felt something crack open in her chest. Not painfully, but inevitably, the way ice cracks in spring when the temperature has been building toward it for weeks. Elias said very quietly, "Clara, I know," she whispered. "What are you going to do?" She looked across the room at Nathaniel, who had not looked for her during his speech, had not turned to find her in the crowd, had not made his public accounting into a performance for her benefit. He had simply said what needed to be said, and now stood in the center of the room, accepting whatever consequence came from it. He was looking at her now. The question was in his eyes, and it was honest, not hopeful, not demanding, simply present. The look of a man who had done what he could and had genuinely arrived at the place where it was no longer his to decide. Clara looked back at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Elias. "Hold on," she said. She handed him his own arm and walked across the ballroom alone. The crowd parted, not dramatically, not in the way of theatrical stories, but practically the way crowds parted for people who were moving with purpose. She crossed the floor and she stopped in front of Nathaniel Vale, and she looked at him, at close range, the way she had been looking at him for 3 weeks, across desks and ledgers and arguments and the long difficult work of building something on top of a wrong. "You should have led with that," she said. Something moved across his face. "I know." Not the speech. Before. In the parlor. "You should have said no to Julian in the parlor." "Yes," he said. "I should have. I need to ask you something." Her voice was steady, but she was holding it steady, which was not the same as it being natural. "Why did it take humiliating me first, before you could be the man in that committee room, Before you could be the man who just stood in this room, why did I have to be worth $3,000 as a joke first? It was the question she had carried for weeks, the one she had not been able to put down, the one that lived underneath all the evidence and the bargains and the growing complicated thing between them that she still hadn't fully named. Nathaniel did not look away. He did not reach for a comfortable answer, which he had half expected and was halfway braced for. "I don't know," he said. "I don't have an answer for that is fair to you." He held her gaze. "I was careless with your name before I knew whose name it was, and that carelessness was a failure that I cannot argue away or explain into something smaller than it was." He paused. "I don't know why it took meeting you to understand what treating you that way meant. I wish I could tell you it would have been different if I had known you first. But I didn't know you. And I should have. I should have understood without knowing you that what Julian proposed was wrong." Clara held his gaze. She was looking for the easy escape in what he'd said, the place where the honesty became performance, where the accountability became a strategy for forgiveness. She was very good at finding those places. She had trained herself on them for 27 years. She didn't find one. "No," she said quietly. "You should have." Yes. They stood in the middle of the governor's ballroom with the candles and the music and the careful attention of New York's most important people arranged around them. "I'm not forgiving you tonight," Clara said. "I want you to understand that clearly. Not because I've decided I won't. Because forgiveness is something I give on my own schedule, not because a room is watching and it would be a tidy ending." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to. You're not asking me for anything." "No." She looked at him for another moment. Then she looked back across the room at Elias, who was standing near the doorway watching her with his father's eyes in his thin, tired face. She turned back to Nathaniel. "My brother wants to study law," she said. Nathaniel blinked. Something shifted in his expression. Confusion first, then attention, then the particular focus of a man recalibrating to a new direction. "All right." He was saving the money before this happened. The money is gone. The time is gone. He's 8 months behind where he should be. She held his gaze. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking if you have connections to someone who would consider him on the merit of his ability rather than the history of someone else's accusation." "Yes," Nathaniel said without hesitation. "I have exactly those connections." "Good." She nodded once. "Then I'd like you to come meet him." Nathaniel looked at her, at this woman who had stepped through a curtain in August and turned a wager into a weapon and protected her brother's evidence for 4 years and stood in a committee room in her mind long before he ever had the courage to stand in one himself. He extended his arm, not a claim, an offer. Clara looked at it. She looked at him. Then, with the deliberate, clear decision of a woman who knew exactly what she was choosing and why, she placed her hand on his arm. They walked back across the ballroom together toward Elias. The room watched. Let it watch. Clara had spent 27 years being watched by rooms, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, she did not feel like what was being watched was her diminishment. Elias met them near the doorway. He shook Nathaniel's hand again, differently this time, with the slight adjustment of a young man who was updating his assessment in real time. "Mr. Vale," he said. "Elias," Nathaniel said, "I understand you want to study law." Elias looked at Clara. She gave him nothing. Kept her expression neutral, the way she kept it neutral when she wanted him to find his own footing. He looked back at Nathaniel. "I do," he said. "I have since I was 19. I read everything I could find. I had a plan before Mercer's people decided I was a convenient name to put on a ledger." "Tell me the plan," Nathaniel said. So Elias told him. Standing in the doorway of the governor's ballroom in his worn coat with the crooked cravat, he laid out with quiet precision the path he had mapped and lost and refused to entirely let go of the study he had intended the cases. He had read the particular area of the law that had always seemed to him most necessary and most neglected. Nathaniel listened. He asked 3 questions. Sharp ones, the kind that required actual thought to answer, the kind that were about Elias's mind rather than his history. Elias answered all three without hesitation. "I know a man in Boston," Nathaniel said. "He runs the most rigorous office in the Northeast. He doesn't care about committee verdicts or newspaper stories. He cares whether you can think." He looked at Elias steadily. "I believe you can. I'll write to him this week." Elias went very still. "Why?" "Because your sister spent 4 years protecting your name with your father's documents when no one with any power was willing to look at them," Nathaniel said simply. "The least I can do is make sure that name means something going forward." A long silence. Then Elias said, "She didn't tell me all of it." "No," Nathaniel said. "She wouldn't." Elias looked at his sister. His eyes were very bright. "Don't," Clara said quietly. "I'm not," he said. His voice was rough. "I'm just looking at you." She let him. She stood in the doorway of the governor's ball in her Aunt Mercy's blue silk dress with her father's ribbon at her wrist and let her brother look at her for as long as he needed, while the music continued behind them and New York continued its evening and the night outside the windows went on and on and on. The morning after the governor's ball, Silas Mercer's lawyers sent a letter to Nathaniel's office. Nathaniel read it standing same as always. It was 6 pages long and contained the word defamation 11 times and the phrase politically motivated character assassination 4 times and the name Aldrich not once, which told Nathaniel everything he needed to know about what Mercer's lawyers understood to be survivable and what they had already quietly decided was not. He set the letter down. He picked up his pen. He wrote 4 words on a blank sheet of paper. "Refer to Albany." Attorney clipped it to the letter and put it in his outgoing correspondence. Then he wrote to Clara. "Mercer's lawyers have responded. 6 pages. Do not be alarmed. This is what men do when they have run out of better options. The Albany attorney is handling it. I wanted you to know before you heard it elsewhere. How is Elias this morning, NV?" Clara read the letter at breakfast. Elias was across the table eating toast with the focused commitment of a man making up for 8 months of inadequate meals. He had color in his face this morning. Small difference. Enormous one. She wrote back, "Elias is eating everything in Aunt Mercy's kitchen. She considers this a personal compliment." 6 pages from Mercer's lawyers is 6 pages from a man who knows he's already lost. "I'm not alarmed." She paused. Then she added, "Thank you for telling me first." She sent it and went back to her breakfast. Elias watched her fold the note. He said nothing, but the expression on his face said a considerable amount. "Don't," Clara said. "I didn't say anything." "Your face did." He picked up another piece of toast. "My face says I'm hungry." "Your face says you have opinions about my correspondence." "My face," Elias said serenely, "is entirely focused on this toast." He took a large bite. "Entirely." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her tea. Then quietly, privately, she smiled. The independent review that the governor had ordered moved faster than anyone expected, which Clara later attributed to the fact that the governor was a man who disliked loose ends and understood that loose ends left too long had a way of becoming nooses. Within 2 weeks, Aldrich had resigned from the committee. The formal announcement cited personal reasons which fooled no one and was not intended to. Aldrich's resignation was the kind of public statement that said everything by saying nothing. The whole city read it and understood perfectly what had not been written between the lines. Mercer lasted longer. Men like Mercer always lasted longer because they had more resources and more lawyers and more practice at converting their worst qualities into defensible positions. His banking operations were put under formal scrutiny in October. By November, 3 of his major accounts had been frozen pending investigation. He retained his house and his club membership and his pleasant smile, but the smile was doing a great deal more work by December than it had been doing in August, and everyone who looked at it could see the effort. Clara followed the proceedings in the newspaper with the careful attention of a woman who had spent 4 years waiting for exactly this and was not going to be careless with it now that it was happening. She did not celebrate. Celebration felt premature. Men like Mercer were capable of surviving a great deal, and she had learned not to count any victory until she could hold the record of it in her hands. What she did instead was plan. The press was in storage on Chambers Street in a warehouse that charged by the month and had been charging for 4 years because Clara had kept the payments going even when she couldn't entirely afford them, because she could not bring herself to let the last physical thing her father had built disappear into someone else's auction. She went to see it on the Tuesday in September after the first cool morning of the season. She had not been inside the warehouse since the spring, and the man at the desk recognized her and nodded and said, "Still in the same spot, Miss Whitfield," which meant he had been checking on it without being asked, which was the kind of small human kindness that hit Clara somewhere unexpected. She went to the back of the warehouse and found her father's press. It was a Ramage hand press, iron-framed, built in Philadelphia in 1801. Her father had bought it second-hand and spent 3 years making it better than new, replacing the worn parts, adjusting the platen, maintaining it with the devotion of a man who understood that his tools were his voice. It was covered now in a canvas sheet, which Clara lifted carefully. The press was exactly as she had left it. Dusty. A little oxidized on the iron fittings, but solid. Intact. Present. She stood in front of it for a long time with her hand on the frame. "Still works," the warehouse man said from behind her. He had followed her in, not intrusively, just present in the way of someone who understood why a person might need a witness for a moment like this. "I ran the mechanism last spring. Checked it. She's sound." "Thank you," Clara said. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not quite. She let them be not quite steady for a moment because there was no one here who would use it against her, and then she steadied them. "I'll be moving it soon," she said. The print shop took 3 months to arrange. Not because the practical details were complicated, they were complicated, but Clara was her father's daughter, and she knew how to manage complicated practical details. It took 3 months because Clara was determined to do it correctly, to find the right space to calculate the finances without borrowing more than she could repay, to plan the first month's work before the first press run, to build something that would last. Nathaniel offered money twice. She said no both times. The first time she said it simply, "No, thank you." The second time she said, "Nathaniel, I need to do this myself, not because I'm too proud to be helped, because I need to know that what I build is mine, built with my hands and my judgment. If you put money into it, I'll always wonder which parts are mine and which parts are yours, and I can't run a print shop on borrowed certainty." He had looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "All right." And he meant it. He didn't offer a third time. He didn't find indirect ways to help that she hadn't technically refused. He simply accepted it, which was, she was beginning to realize the thing he did. When someone gave him an honest answer, he heard it, and he adjusted, and he didn't make them defend it again. What he did instead was talk to his Veterans Families Organization, a network he'd been building quietly since the committee proceedings, connecting families of militia casualties with employment and legal assistance, and the basic practical support that distinguished between surviving and living. He didn't put his name on it prominently. Clara noticed that. She noticed it the way she noticed everything about him now carefully, with attention to the distinction between what was performed and what was real. It was real. Elias left for Boston in October. The night before he left, he and Clara sat up late in Aunt Mercy's kitchen, the way they used to sit up late in their father's kitchen when they were children. Elbows on the table, 2 cups of tea gone cold. The particular ease of people who had known each other long enough that silence between them required no explanation. "Write to me," Clara said. "Every week," he said. "Nathaniel's man in Boston will look out for you. Don't be too proud to let him. That's rich coming from you." "I know exactly how rich it is. I'm saying it anyway." She looked at her brother. "You're going to be extraordinary, Elias." He looked at his hands. He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, "what you did. The 4 years. The ledgers. He stopped, started again. I know you didn't do it expecting to be thanked for it. No, she said, but I want to say it. He looked up. Thank you. Not for saving me. I know you hate that framing. The corner of his mouth moved. Thank you for believing the truth was worth the trouble of protecting. For not letting anyone convince you that what happened to me was simply how things worked, and there was no point in fighting it. Clara looked at her brother. At the 23 years of him, the thinness that was already beginning to fill back in the crooked cravat that he still hadn't entirely mastered. Father believed the truth was worth the trouble, she said. I just followed his example. You did more than that. Maybe. She picked up her cold tea. Drink your tea, Elias. You have an early morning. He drank his tea. They sat in the quiet kitchen until midnight, and when they finally went to bed, Clara lay in the dark and felt the shape of the coming months, Elias in Boston, the print shop on Pearl Street, spring, arriving eventually, as it always did. She pressed her thumb to the ribbon. She slept. No. The print shop opened on a Thursday in March. The first morning was very quiet. Clara had the press running by 7, the ink mixed correctly, the first broadside laid out with the particular care of someone who had been composing this work in her head for 4 years. It was a simple piece, a notice of the shop's establishment, the services offered, the rates. Practical, unadorned. Her father would have called it good business and meant it as the highest possible compliment. She ran 50 copies and stacked them on the counter and stood back and looked at what she had made. The door opened at 9:30. She expected a customer. She got Aunt Mercy instead, who walked in, looked at the press, looked at the stacked broadsides, and pressed both hands to her mouth for a moment before she collected herself. It smells like your father's shop, Aunt Mercy said. I know, Clara said. That's not sad, Aunt Mercy said firmly, as if she was disagreeing with something. That's exactly right. That's exactly what it should be. She sat down in the chair by the window and took one of the broadsides from the counter and read it carefully. Clara went back to work. They stayed in comfortable silence for an hour, which was, Clara thought, as good an opening as any shop could ask for. Nathaniel came at noon. He knocked. He waited. He had never in all their months of working together simply walked into a room she was in without some acknowledgement of the threshold, some knock or pause or glance that asked rather than assumed. She had noticed this in his office, in Aunt Mercy's parlor, in the committee hallway. She noticed it now. She opened the door. He was standing with his hat in his hands, the same posture as the night he'd come to warn her about the newspaper. The posture she now understood was not deference exactly, but something more specific. The physical acknowledgement that where he stood was not automatically his to occupy. I heard you opened, he said. This morning, she said. Come in. He came in. He looked at the press the way people who understood mechanical things looked at them, with the attention of actual interest rather than polite acknowledgement. He looked at the broadsides on the counter. He picked one up and read it. Good rates, he said. Competitive. Good paper. My father's supplier. He's been holding the account open for 4 years. I think he felt guilty. She picked up an ink cloth and turned back to the press. He probably should have. Nathaniel set the broadside down. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him in the room behind her, not pressing, not requiring anything, simply present. It's a good shop, Clara, he said. She stopped what she was doing. She didn't turn around. Thank you, she said. I mean it without conditions. I know. She did know. That was the thing she had been working out slowly over the months between the ball and this March morning, the difference between what he said and what he meant, and her growing certainty that in his case they were usually the same thing. It had taken her this long to trust that certainty, which was not a character failing, but a reasonable response to the world she had lived in. I know you do. She turned around. He was looking at her with the expression she had learned to read over weeks of close quarters, the one that asked without asking, the one that left the answer entirely to her. Nathaniel, she said, I want to ask you something. All right. Why are you here today specifically? Not generally. I know you've been watching the shop come together. I know you spoke to my landlord. She saw his expression shift and held up a hand. I'm not angry about that. He told me. You vouched for me to a landlord who didn't know my name, and that is a practical thing that cost you nothing and cost me a great deal of time if you hadn't. I'm not angry. She looked at him steadily. But why are you here today? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I wanted to see it. Finished. Running. He paused. Because I wanted to see you in it. This is where you belong. This is what all of it was for. The ledgers, the committee, all of it. It was for this room, and I wanted to see it. Clara held his gaze. You could have sent a note. I could have, he agreed. You didn't. No. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside Pearl Street was going about its business carts. Voices, the ordinary percussion of a city that did not pause for private reckonings. The press smelled of ink and iron. Her father's press. I'm not the same woman who stepped through that curtain in August, she said. I know, he said. She was remarkable. He stopped. You're something I don't have an adequate word for. Try. He looked at her. Something in his face settled not into ease exactly, but into honesty. The particular honesty of a man who has decided that whatever the answer costs him, he is going to give it anyway. Necessary, he said. You are the most necessary person I have ever met. Not necessary to me specifically. Necessary the way a press is necessary. The way truth written down is necessary. You are the kind of person the world requires and too often buries, and I watched the world try to bury you, and I was part of that, and I am grateful beyond my ability to say it, that the world failed. Silence. Clara pressed her thumb to the ribbon at her wrist. She felt the familiar edge of it, the dark silk worn smooth from 4 years of the same gesture. I forgive you, she said. He went very still. Not because it's convenient, she said. Not because this room is pretty and the morning is going well and it makes a tidy ending. I forgive you because I've been watching you for 7 months, and I know who you are, and who you are is not who you were in that parlor in August, and carrying the weight of what you were in August forever would be... She paused. It would be the same thing they did to Elias. Deciding someone's worst moment is their truest one. He said nothing. She watched him absorb it the way he absorbed everything she said carefully, without reaching for it too fast. That's not the same as forgetting it, she said. I won't forget it. I don't want you to, he said. I want you to know who I was, so you can know who I'm trying to be. I do know, Clara said. That's why I'm telling you. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes that she hadn't noticed in August and now knew by heart. He did not reach for her hand. He waited. Clara looked at him. This man, who had read 4 hours of ledgers, who had said, I'm sorry without armor, who had crossed a ballroom and told the truth in front of everyone, and then waited, had been waiting, she realized since that night, for her to decide. She lifted her hand and placed it against his jaw, and felt the particular solidity of him, the warmth, the alive reality of a person who had been abstract to her for months, and was now simply and completely here. He put his hand over hers. That was all. He just held it there. They stood in the print shop on Pearl Street, in the March morning, and held still, and the press waited, and the broadsides waited, and the city outside went on with its business, and something that had begun in a parlor in August as a wrong, and had become something else entirely through the long, difficult, unglamorous work of 2 people, choosing honesty over comfort. That thing settled now into its final shape. Not perfect, not simple, not the kind of ending that required no future, the best kind. The twist came 2 weeks later, and it came from Boston. Elias wrote, and his letter was unusually long. Elias, who believed in economy of words on the page, the way their father had believed in economy of type. Clara read it once quickly, the way she read things that might be difficult, and then she read it again slowly, The man in Boston Nathaniel's contact the attorney Elias had gone to study under had not taken Elias simply as a favor to Nathaniel Vale. He had taken him because in the interview that Nathaniel had arranged, Elias had answered 3 questions about evidentiary procedure with a precision and original thinking that the attorney described in his own note to Nathaniel, which Elias had apparently been shown as the most promising legal mind I have encountered in a decade of practice. That was not the twist. The twist was the case Elias was now working on as a junior observer, barely 4 months and technically not qualified to do more than carry files and watch. A case involving fraudulent accounts, militia supply contracts, 3 families in Connecticut who had lost men to the same supply accident that had killed Thomas Vale in 1813, and who had been denied compensation on the basis of accounting irregularities. That looked, Elias wrote, disturbingly familiar. It's Mercer's pattern, Elias wrote. Different state, different year, different names, same method. Clara. I think this goes further than New York. I think this is a system, not a single crime. I'm going to need father's ledgers. Clara read it 3 times. Then she sat down and wrote back immediately. I'll send everything. Take the copies, I'm keeping the originals here. And Elias, be careful. If this is what you think it is, be careful. She sealed the letter. Then she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. She thought about Mercer in his house, still with his club membership, and his pleasant smile. The investigation stalled at the state level, where the political machinery moved slowly, and the evidence was strong, but not yet devastating. She thought about Connecticut, about 3 families who had lost men in 1813 and had been told the accounting didn't support their claims. She thought about her father's press 20 feet away, ink in the mechanism paper stacked and waiting. She got up, she went to the press, she began composing type. Nathaniel came in an hour later and found her working. He read the pace of her, the particular focused intensity she had when something mattered, and he said without preamble, "What happened?" She handed him Elias's letter. He read it. His expression went through the same sequence hers had, the quick reading, then the slower one, then the stillness. Connecticut, he said. Elias thinks it's the same method, different geography, Clara said. She adjusted the type block. If it is, the Albany documentation becomes evidence in a federal case, not just a state committee matter. That changes the scope considerably. Yes, she said. Which is why I'm printing it. Nathaniel looked up. You're printing it now. I'm printing the documentation of what we found here, Clara said. The accounting trail. The method. Formatted for wide distribution. She met his eyes. If it's the same pattern, other people need to know how to recognize it. Families in Connecticut. Families in other states. The people who process these claims need to know what to look for. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're making it a public record. I'm making it a press record, she said, which is the same thing my father did for 22 years, which is what this press is for. He looked at her. He looked at the press. He looked at the ink on her hands and the type blocks in front of her, and the particular set of her jaw that he had learned over 7 months meant that what was happening in front of him was not a beginning, but a continuation. The latest expression of something that had been true about Clara Whitfield long before he ever heard her name put up for $3,000 in a parlor in August. What do you need? He said. Paper, she said. There's more in the back room, and I need you to write down everything you know about the 1813 supply lines, the routes, the contractors, the names, while I can still cross-reference it against the ledger notation. He was already moving toward the back room. I'll need a pen. Desk by the window, she said. Second drawer. He found the pen. He sat down at the desk by the window, and he opened the second drawer and found the pen and a clean sheet of paper, and he began to write, and the press began to move, and the March morning came through the window and lay across the floor of the shop on Pearl Street. Months later, in a letter to Elias that she did not expect him to read in full, Clara tried to explain what had changed and what hadn't. She wrote, Father used to say the press doesn't care who's angry. I used to think that meant the press was indifferent. I understand now that he meant something different. He meant the press is constant. The press doesn't stop because someone is frightened of what it will say. It doesn't pause because the people who stand in front of it are unsure of their welcome or their worth. It runs or it doesn't run, and the only thing that determines which one is whether someone is willing to stand there and work. That's what I'm doing, Goliath. I'm standing there and working. Not for anyone else's approval. Not to prove anything to anyone who already made up their mind about us in August, or 4 years ago, or 20 years ago. Because the work is worth doing, and I am capable of doing it, and there is a press that was built for exactly this purpose. Father would have understood. She sealed the letter. She turned back to the press. And on a spring morning in New York in the year 1817, Clara Whitfield stood in her father's print shop on Pearl Street and took the black printer's ribbon from her wrist, the ribbon she had worn every day for 4 years. The ribbon she had pressed through every difficult hour of the investigation, through the wager, and the bargain, and the committee room, and the governor's ball. And she tied it around the handle of the restored Ramage press. She did not take it off because she was finished with grief. She placed it on the press because grief properly held does not diminish you. It teaches you what matters enough to fight for, and then it becomes the fuel. Her father was in these walls. In the smell of the ink, and the weight of the iron, and the clean precision of type, set by careful hands. He was in the broadsides stacked on the counter, and the letters going out to Connecticut, and the work that had begun in a trunk under a bed on Reed Street, and would not stop. Not now, not for Mercer's lawyers, or Aldrich's silence, or anyone else's careful opinion about what a woman in reduced circumstances was worth. Clara set her hand flat on the press frame and felt the solidity of it. Outside Pearl Street moved. Elias was in Boston building the career that should have started 4 years ago. Aunt Mercy was somewhere nearby, probably reading and pretending not to be watching the door. Nathaniel was across the city writing testimony for the federal inquiry that had begun to gather around Mercer's name like weather around a ridge. Clara was here, in her shop, at her press, her father's ribbon on the handle and her own hands on the work. A woman's worth is not decided by marriage or scandal or the price a careless man puts on her name in a candlelit parlor. It is decided every single day by what she chooses to build when the room stops watching, and by whether she is still standing at the press when the truth needs someone willing to run it. Clara Whitfield was still standing. She always had been.